This man has been running an unauthorized gathering in direct violation of Maplewood Glen community standards. I warned him repeatedly. I issued him multiple notices and he ignored every single one. He also deliberately left me off the guest list. HOA President Rowena Parker showed up at the front door of 18 Cedarwood Lane and told the homeowner that private residential gatherings were strictly prohibited under Maplewood Glen community standards. That a $5,000 fine had been placed against his deed for continuing with party preparations without board authorization, and that the only way she'd consider pulling the fine and letting the event go forward was if he gave her a personal invitation that included reserved seating, a dedicated host, and treatment she described as befitting her standing in the community. She said it as though it were a perfectly ordinary administrative arrangement. What she had no idea about was that the homeowner had been recording every conversation since her very first threat, that the HOA handbook contained no prohibition on residential gatherings of any kind, that the false police report she was about to file was going to become a criminal matter entirely on its own, and that the restraining order already being drafted against her was going to be the most publicly humiliating ending to an HOA presidency Gwinnett County had ever seen. Damian Decker, 37, a marketing director for a mid-size retail brand headquartered out of Atlanta, had lived at 18 Cedarwood Lane in the Maplewood Glen subdivision of Lawrenceville, Georgia for 3 years. Maplewood Glen sat in Gwinnett County, a middle-class neighborhood of brick-front homes, tree-lined streets, and the kind of community where weekend cookouts and front porch conversations were simply part of how people lived there. Damian had bought his home after years of apartment living and spent his first 2 years getting to know his neighbors closely enough to consider most of them real friends. He was sociable, organized, and the kind of person who read the fine print before he did anything else. He had been planning the party for 6 weeks. A milestone birthday celebration for his closest friends and neighbors, fully catered, with a playlist he'd put together himself, and a back patio he'd strung with lights the weekend before. Before he sent out a single invitation, he did exactly what a responsible homeowner would do. He walked over to the Maplewood Glen HOA office on Birchwood Drive and asked whether there were any community guidelines he needed to follow for a private residential gathering. The woman sitting behind the desk was Rowena Parker. Rowena, 55, had served as HOA president of Maplewood Glen for 8 straight years and had built a particular reputation among residents for locating problems that didn't exist and arriving at solutions that somehow always worked in her favor. She told Damian that private parties were not permitted in Maplewood Glen, that it was a community standard meant to protect residents from noise and disruption, and that he'd need to cancel his plans or face formal enforcement action. Damian thanked her politely, went home, and took out the Maplewood Glen HOA handbook that had been sitting in his file since the day he closed on the house. He read every page that evening.
There was no prohibition on private residential gatherings anywhere in the document. Not a clause, not a footnote, not a single line. He placed the catering order the next morning.
Before we go any further, tell us what city or country you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where our viewers tune in from. And if you believe a homeowner has every right to host a party in his own home without asking anyone's permission, hit that like and subscribe button, and join us here on HOA Unhinged. Rowena did not respond quietly to the news that Damian was pressing ahead with his plans. She appeared at 18 Cedarwood Lane 3 days after their first conversation, and handed him a formal violation notice, accusing his party preparations of constituting a community disturbance under what she called Maplewood Glen residential conduct standards. The fine was $1,200. Damian photographed the notice, opened the HOA handbook to the table of contents, and spent 10 minutes confirming once again that no such standard appeared anywhere in the document. He filed the notice in a folder and went back to finalizing his guest list. The second notice arrived 4 days after that. This one cited the string lights he'd hung on his back patio as an unapproved exterior modification under Section 3.5 of the Maplewood Glen Architectural Guidelines. Damian looked up Section 3.5 and found it applied to permanent structural additions to a home's exterior. String lights on a patio for a single weekend event were not a permanent structural addition under any fair reading of that language, or any other. He slipped the notice into the folder. Rowena came to his door a third time the following week. This time she abandoned the administrative framing entirely. She told Damian point blank that she had the authority to have his event shut down by law enforcement on the night it took place, and that the only way she would back off was if he gave her what she called a proper personal invitation. She laid out exactly what that meant. Reserved parking at the front of his driveway, a dedicated seat at the best table, personal acknowledgement from Damian throughout the evening, and a gift bag assembled specifically for her. She delivered this list with the confidence of someone who genuinely believed she was extending a fair offer. Damian looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her he'd think about it and shut the door. He called his attorney immediately and walked him through the entire conversation. His attorney told him to document everything from this point forward, every interaction, every notice, every word spoken, and that what Rowena had just laid out was an abuse of HOA authority that edged into potential extortion territory, depending on how far she decided to push it. Damien began recording every interaction with her from that day on. He did not send Rowena an invitation of any description. The fines continued arriving over the next 2 weeks. A noise pre-violation issued before the party had even occurred. A parking notice targeting vehicles belonging to his caterers during missile delivery. And a letter on official HOA letterhead warning that law enforcement would be called on the night of the event if the gathering moved forward without board authorization. The total fines accumulated against his deed had reached $5,000, and Rowena had started invoking lien proceedings in her most recent correspondence. Damien paid nothing, canceled nothing, and uninvited no one. He confirmed the catering, locked in the playlist, and sent his guests a follow-up with the start time and parking directions. He also had 2 additional outdoor cameras installed covering his driveway and the front of his property. Not because he was concerned about the party, but because he wanted a clean, documented record of anything that took place outside his home on the night. Rowena had promised to involve the police. Both immediate neighbors on Cedarwood Lane had been invited. 3 neighbors from across the street had been invited as well. The only person on the block who hadn't received an invitation was Rowena Parker, and she had spent 2 weeks ensuring Damien knew precisely how she felt about that. The night of the party came on a Saturday in October. Damien's house was lit up. The music was running at a considerate volume. 40 guests were spread across the back garden and patio, talking and eating and enjoying themselves. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. Then the police arrived. 2 Gwinnett County officers pulled up to 18 Cedarwood Lane at 9:47 p.m. Damien caught the headlights from the back patio and walked around to the front of the house to meet them before anyone knocked. He was unhurried and completely calm, and had been anticipating this moment since the evening Rowena first promised it would happen. He introduced himself at the front door, told the officers he was the homeowner, and invited them inside without a moment's hesitation. The officers explained that a call had come in reporting suspicious activity and noise violations at the address. Damien nodded, opened the door fully, and gestured for them to see for themselves. They walked through the house, stepped out onto the back patio, and looked at 40 people eating, talking, and listening to music at a volume that neither neighbor on either side had raised a single complaint about. Then they looked at each other. One officer checked the decibel level with his department's device. It read well below the Gwinnett County Noise Ordinance threshold. The other officer walked the full perimeter of the property and found nothing that amounted to a violation of any kind. They were back at the front door in 12 minutes. Damien handed the senior officer a printed copy of the Maplewood Glen HOA handbook, open to the table of contents, and asked him to point to any section that prohibited private residential gatherings. The officer looked it over briefly and handed it back without a word. Damien then played him the recordings of Rowena's demand for a personal invitation as the explicit condition for allowing the party to go ahead. The officer's face didn't shift, but what he wrote in his notepad took longer than a single line. The officers thanked Damien, walked back to their cruiser, and were gone by 10:01 p.m. The party ran uninterrupted for another 2 hours. Across the street, Rowena Parker had been stationed at her front window from the moment the patrol car appeared. She watched it leave. She watched the lights on Damien's patio stay on. She watched his guests keep laughing and heard the music still playing, and understood in that moment that it had not gone the way she planned. Damien was already drafting the restraining order application before the last guest walked out. He filed it with Gwinnett County Superior Court first thing Monday morning. His attorney submitted it with a thorough supporting package. Every violation notice Rowena had issued, the audio recordings of her personal invitation demand, the documented timeline linking each fine directly to his refusal to meet her personal conditions, and the police report from the night of the party, confirming that responding officers had found no violation of any kind at 18 Cedarwood Lane. The court reviewed the submission and granted the restraining order within the week. Rowena Parker was formally barred from contacting Damien, approaching his property, or reaching him through any channel, including HOA correspondence. The false police report became a separate legal matter. Filing a deliberately false report with law enforcement is a misdemeanor under Georgia Code 1610-26, and the responding officers had already noted in their incident report that the call bore no relation to the conditions they found at the address. The Gwinnett County District Attorney's Office reviewed the report and launched a formal inquiry into the filing. Rowena's personal attorney instructed her to make no further public statements. The Maplewood Glen HOA Board called an emergency session 3 days after the restraining order was granted and removed Rowena from the presidency by unanimous vote. They ordered a comprehensive review of every enforcement action she had taken across her 8-year tenure and uncovered a consistent pattern of fabricated violations filed against residents who had either turned down her personal requests or challenged her authority in public. 4 residents submitted their own formal complaints in the months that followed. The $5,000 in fines Rowena had stacked against Damien's deed were declared entirely unenforceable and dismissed. She was ordered to cover his legal fees. The financial and legal fallout from everything she had set in motion over a party invitation moved faster than she'd planned for. Damien Decker threw another party at 18 Cedarwood Lane the following summer. Same patio, same lights, same music. He didn't ask anyone for permission, and he didn't put together a special invitation for anyone who hadn't earned one. If this story reminded you that the best response to someone who treats a title like a personal bargaining chip is to document every word and let the courts take it from there, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you've ever been threatened, fined, or pressured by an HOA president who turned community rules into personal favors, drop your story in the comments. We are always listening. See you on the next one, right here on HOA Unhinged.